All right, guys, we're live on air. Welcome to the Scholar and Gentleman Study Pub. We're starting our Dostoevsky discussion and reading group for Brothers Karamazov. Today we're talking about the author's introduction and book one. Did everybody do the reading?
Yes.
This is an amazing group.
My copy got delayed due to some weather we've had up here, and it won't be arriving until Tuesday, so I'm just going to be listening in.
Okay. So a couple ground rules before we dive in. The biggest one is some people have read this before multiple times, and some people have never read it. So if you've read this before or you're reading ahead of schedule, please don't give away what's coming. No spoilers, basically. It may be okay to say, like, pay attention to this thing that happened today. It will have some significance, but you got to keep it real vague. So that's my one request. Beyond that, this is a totally open discussion. It can take any number of directions, and I think for now we'll see how it goes. Just letting people chime in spontaneously. Hopefully, we're not such a big group that's pure chaos. So I hope you've enjoyed what we've read so far. It's kind of weird because it's mostly just backstory, and so it's more just narrative. I forgot the word I'm looking for. It's more explanatory than actual action happening. So not nearly as interesting as most of the book. The next section gets pretty exciting already right off the bat, and the colorful characters start flying around. So if this didn't seem like a thrilling beginning, stay tuned for next week. And it pretty much, you won't be let down from then on. It's a bit of a slow start. Still, I think it's got some funny moments, and you're getting to see the colorful characters. And frankly, it's basically already a Maury Povich episode in terms of dysfunctional families. So,
before
what's that?
I ask something real quick. So I will get the translation everyone's working off of. So I have the same scholarly notes that you guys have. Is there anything in your edition that talks about what parts of the book were published? Because I know when it was published as a serial, I'd be really interested in knowing if it's like was published by chapters or if all of book one was published together. Because I don't know. I'd be very interested to know that. Because if it's published in a newspaper, I don't know how much you can put in a single edition.
I believe it was by chapter. I'm not sure that's true for every single, or I mean, not chapter, by book, like how there's book one and then book, like each of the things we're reading. I think there's a few times when those are broken up, but I haven't looked at my notes in that in a while, so I can't say for sure.
The reason why I was curious is because Mr. McGarvey is right when he says there's so much exposition and slowness in this first part. And I'm just thinking to myself, how could it even sell if, how is this even selling if it starts so not boring, but you get what I'm saying, but by comparison with the rest of it.
Yeah, that, by the way, exposition is the exact word I was looking for. And I don't know the answer to that. I would guess, though, at this point, Dostoevsky was famous enough that him starting a new novel, he could take one slow chapter and probably still get it sold. That'd just be my guess.
Well, also, when I taught this, I used to tell my students, like, I do think there's something for remembering that a lot of giant 19th century novels have a lot of exposition. I don't know. I feel like readers had a much higher tolerance for that. Like, I don't know. To me, this one, it's pretty funny, too. So I don't find it terribly tedious.
Yeah, I mean, find it pretty entertaining.
He seems like he's making a lot of like observations about the time that it didn't seem like boring exposition to me. It felt like he was kind of sarcastically commenting on people's perceptions of each other. And in the time, like the way he talked about his first wife looking at I don't know how to say Russian names, Fyodor, as like some kind of like transgenerational figure and everyone else just thinks he's an idiot. Like, it seems deeply human.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, because throughout the book, you get so many like character portraits that aren't necessarily plot points, you know. And I would almost say it's almost a stretch to call this thing a novel in a way. I made some note that it's not really a novel at all. It's more of a deep dive into human nature and character portraits, you know, especially the irrational parts of ourselves. So entertaining character portraits are definitely like a big part of it. And sometimes they're not like necessary to the plot, but I do think sometimes they're necessary to maybe a bigger picture. Part of what Dostoevsky seems to be doing is presenting just a whole lot of different contrasting views of life, you know? And so it's kind of like compare this guy's view with this guy's view and see which one works out better, you know?
I also like that when he was introducing each of the characters, I can't find the exact line because I didn't actually make notes or anything, but he says things several times like, well, this person was kind of like this, but we kind of all are, or a lot of people are like that, or, you know, maybe he seemed like an idiot, but he was really human, and things like that sort of makes the characters universal in a way, and also shows that Dostoevsky is kind of recognizing that these things that we often see as faults or as weird things in other people are actually common to a lot of us.
Are you talking about Fyodor play acting? I feel like when you said that, like, oh, everybody does that.
Yeah.
Or many people do that.
Yeah, it came up sometime, a few different times. I think with almost all of the characters, but definitely with Fyodor's like play acting. I wish I had actually made a note of the one sentence where it really struck me.
Ginny, I might be able to help you. I have one underlined on page 9. Here's where we all find out if we have the same actual page numbers.
Yes, at the very end of 9. I'm on the same page as you.
You want to read that, what line you're talking about?
Yeah, so in most cases, people, even wicked people, are far more naive and simple-hearted than one generally assumes. And so are we. And I just love that. Thank you for underlining it, because I didn't.
Yeah, and that's right after like his first wife dies and he runs out in the street basically yelling hallelujah, and then he's sobbing 2 minutes later.
I think it's also important to note that, and this isn't obviously in the notes of what you've read, but obviously like all the great Russian critics wrote a lot on Dostoevsky, and one of my favorite critics to talk about it was Vladimir Propp. I don't know if you guys know who that is, but he was a structuralist. But Dostoevsky, you know, when people would sometimes ask him about his work and they would say, do you identify with any of your characters? He would jokingly always say all of them. And I've always felt that he was definitely at least all 3 brothers, Karamazov and the father. Like, there's no doubt, right? He's at least all of them.
Yeah, and I've definitely wondered if it seems to me beyond coincidence that, you know, the buffoon father shares his exact same name, right?
I don't know if I should say, is it okay to say like what many critics say the brothers represent in a general way, the 3 brothers represent in a general way, or?
I mean, you can sure talk about that. I mean, it's something that often comes up in discussion.
Okay, so, you know, does everybody know that it's supposed to be intellect, passions, and soul? That those are the 3 brothers?
You want to go a little deeper in that?
Okay, so obviously Dmitri would be the passions, you know, and then Ivan would be the intellect, and Alyosha would be the soul. And I think that sometimes a lot of people have felt that Dostoevsky in those characters is representing like the 3 parts of himself, both the best, you know, and each one of them has and the interplay between the 3. And that's why I always thought that that's how the novel could be so thin on plot in some ways, is because it's not really about a story. It's about the human. It's about analyzing the human being in general.
But I do think like I find that interesting, but I'm also a little cautious to read this too strictly as an allegory because I feel like each character is like I already feel in this first chapter we're starting to see how many of the brothers share qualities too, right? They aren't just each like a symbol of some abstract thing. They're full humans that are very complicated. So and I mean, like, I think that's super interesting, but I'm always, especially because, like, what like McGee was saying, this is so psychologically complex that I'm like a little like I don't know if I want to totally read them as each just a symbol and some because I feel like and this is where it's hard because I have read this book so many times but I'm like we're gonna see that this isn't a spoiler but like we're gonna see that Alyosha has anger and passions just like Dmitri and so does Ivan and that there's so I just thought I'd throw that in there too.
Yeah, and what's interesting to see is how each different character reacts to the same circumstance or internal conflict or idea in different ways. We don't know them very much at all yet. You mainly get to see how they got dragged all over the place as kids. But I think also to that, just a little more background with the in terms of the comment, like why isn't this like a novel? Did everyone read the note from the author where he basically apologizes for writing the entire book? And we mentioned this last week, or not last week, but last time. But it's worth mentioning again that this is supposed to be part one of 2 novels. Like, this is supposed to just be the backstory to the real novel that he intended to write. Who knows if that was real or not, but I think so. I think he had a big plan for this story arc of his hero Alyosha.
Right.
So
it's been contested what it is, but there are a lot of people who have said that Dostoevsky had talked about it with certain fellow writers, and that it was about Alyosha and Dmitri, and maybe also Ivan in the working camps.
Okay.
So
it'd be interesting to see what notes or sketches are available of any other thoughts he had of where the story might go beyond this book. But I think it stands alone anyway, but it's just worth mentioning, like, he did apologize himself for writing this thing saying, it doesn't really go anywhere.
Well, earlier when you mentioned it, somebody mentioned about it being published as a serial. I actually wondered if they published like the author's note at the beginning, like with the first installment.
Yeah.
So if the people reading it in installments like got that sort of apology or not.
Right. Especially for the first section.
Yeah, right.
I don't know the answer to that. Were there any particularly striking moments that people want to bring up, or just general observations? I'm just opening it up to wherever you guys want to go with this chapter.
Well, I always thought in terms of book 1, the most fascinating part is the last part when they talk about the elders, just because it's just so severe, and I feel like there's something about the way Dostoevsky sets it up where just the idea having to set up that Alyosha has absolute faith in his elder. And I feel like that's just a really important thing to think about going forward. And I feel like everything is being painted in such broad colors and bold colors where everything is trying to be done by contrast. And I feel like that's definitely being intentionally contrast with like the cynicism of his father, as well as the skepticism of his older brother. I feel like all of these characters, and I agree with the person who said we shouldn't just see them as allegories because they're far deeper and more complex than that. Completely agree. I think that it's just amazing how he just does. He reveals so much about all of these different parts of humanity by showing how they contrast in such bold and vivid style. I don't know. I feel as like someone who loves art history, I would love to see like the Russian painting of the time to see if they loved big, bold colors and all sorts of chiaroscuro and light and dark and contrast. Because I feel like he just does such an amazing job trying to show everything in just stark relief and contrast. So as I'm reading it, even though, yes, it's this kind of slow exposition, I still feel the bold colors are still in there, even in the exposition. That's just my thought.
I agree with that. I think that's characteristic throughout the whole novel. You know, as I mentioned, sometimes it's helpful not even to think about the plot so much as, or like that this is a story with a start and a finish, as much as a whole bunch of character vignettes in relief, throwing light and shadow on each other. And I think even more central than the question of plot is just kind of how these things matter in terms of, you know, what do we understand, how it means to be human, and how we should live. It's just kind of a series of contrasting and conflicting options, you know, personalities, like the way we more deeply understand ourselves and each other, what is and isn't in our control, what do we like to think about ourselves versus actually do. There's a lot of irony, even in this section already. I think you can see, like, here's a great example of a contrast and relief that we've already run into. So Fyodor basically has Dmitri and then immediately forgets that he has a son, and he gets brought up in the hut outside by the servant, and more or less abandoned. And eventually, this Miasov, the sort of enlightened philanthropist, humanist, and liberal, comes in, kind of grabs the kid, is like, we got to take care of this kid, brings him home, then gets interested to travel to Paris, and essentially abandons him just the same way that Fyodor did, you know, but with better intentions. So pretty interesting little relief there. And I think you'll see a lot more of that type of stuff if you pay attention. Did anyone else notice something like that between the characters?
Well, and I think that, as you point that out, I feel like that directly corresponds with what I just mentioned about the elders and this figure of the father. The idea of the part of the basic, because since fatherhood is one of the major themes of the novel, I feel like that's one of the major contrasting things in the development of the characters. Their experience of fathers and then their view of what fatherhood is based upon the relationships they have in that regard.
I suppose you could say that Alyosha is the only one that is actually finding a father that takes him in completely with his elder or whatever. And then you have the strange return of Ivan to his father, and they suddenly get along for no apparent reason. Surprisingly. You're right about that fatherhood thing. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, and it's also important because the question of what actually is a father is going to be explicitly thematically important, you know, particularly later.
Did you guys think this was funny? Were there funny parts? Because I found some of it pretty funny.
I actually, before we go into that, I wanted to point out something. I was just kind of pausing to give some space. Like, I noticed, like you said, the sort of tension contrast between all of the characters and how they relate to money, which, like I felt like it was really important that you have Dmitri, who we already know at the end of this first section is trying to get money out of his father and seems to spend it like crazy. We have Ivan, who's very, very responsible, but is very bitter and angry at having grown up on others' charity. And then you have Alyosha, who I feel like it's really central to his character that they keep talking about how, you know, you could drop him off in any town on earth and he'd either be taken care of or he'd find a way to take care of himself. Like, there's this real insistence from the narrator that he's not a mooch or something. He's just like, he accepts and gives really generously. Like, people will help him, he'll help people. And then you also have Fyodor, who somehow manages to make a bunch of money while seeming to be an idiot. So, like, I feel like that is the central theme that comes up in every one of their chapters. Is there's some real tensions about how they all relate to having property or money or being taken care of in the world.
Yeah, and even Miasov gets this one line that says he's ticklish on the subject of money and like honesty in the bourgeois or something like that.
I also noticed, and this might just be my own sort of ignorance about history and social systems and whatever, but when they, I forget in whose narrative it was, but when they mentioned socialism, they tied socialism explicitly to being an atheist, which seems strange to me, not knowing the history, but being like pretty firmly, Jesus wasn't a capitalist myself. I thought, I don't know, I thought it was interesting, strange.
It was historically very, very, and in a lot of places still is. It's, you know, aggressively atheistic.
Well, and I think McGee, you could probably say more about this, but I know from when we were talking about the book, like back before we got married, you were the one that gave me a lot of background on how that's a particularly Russian issue, like that the all of these things historically going on, like the breaking down of the serf system. So it's like not even being juxtaposed to capitalism so much as like the old landowner serf system, and then you have socialism coming in, but that's being linked to the church, which holds a place in Russian culture that is very different from what we understand as Americans. I don't know. I'm sort of fumbling through what McGee told me.
Well, yeah, and I think also it's worth remembering that the 19th century was a time of absolutely dramatic intellectual and social upheaval throughout Europe and particularly in Russia. So I think nowadays we're able to separate the idea of a socialist economy, perhaps, or some form of it from, you know, a religious system, and they may interact in different ways. And I do think the sort of people that advanced socialism at that time also felt it necessary to break from the church and say there is no God, and this is, you know, the opiate of the masses and all that sort of thing. So I think, like, I don't think it's logically necessary to connect the two, but I think historically they were connected, and particularly in that place, you know.
I guess that makes sense. I figured it was probably historical. I guess what I was wondering is then what would be sort of the government or economy or system that would be connected to the church, because I don't think it was capitalism at that time in Russia. But
Well,
what?
Yeah. At this time in the book, it's
Feudalism.
at least when the story is taking place, it's not that long after the emancipation of the serfs. So you basically had feudalism still in Russia up until that point. People were bound to the land, and it's still the living generations like Fyodor and so forth would have had serfs who were, you know, bound to their service or whatever. And you even see that in some of the language in this chapter where they calculate the
By the souls.
the wealth of your estate on the number of souls, which is more or less how many slaves have you got, you know.
And that's why I wondered, was that tied to the church then? Because that seems also very
I don't know
to a modern ear, I suppose.
the answer to that.
Bible,
Sorry,
so.
I cut off your thought there. We have some people breaking up. I think I might have missed something, Ginny. I don't think the church. I don't know the answer to that historically. I don't think that the serf system was necessarily, you know, directly being maintained and promoted by the church, or that they felt. I don't honestly know the answer to that. That's a part of history that would be kind of cool if someone.
I thought it was, but I could be mistaken. I thought the church owned land and upheld that system.
Okay.
Yeah, and not only that, but some of the literature, especially some of the propaganda literature at the time, was heavily showing clerics as some of the worst of the, and so that was one of the reasons why, attacking the Tsar could be also talked about, attacking the church, because, the piety, kind of the link of piety and how those two things went together, it really was Caesar and Christ in that system. And so when you have the church so closely institutionally, because the Tsar was still crowned by the church, so, even though that's a formality, we all know that, but still political power. But I guess my point is that I don't know if you can be, I don't know, considering like the intrinsic togetherness of it, I don't know. It's kind of hard to say you're a socialist and not also be anti the church. Not necessarily atheistic, but it's hard to be not anti the church if you're going to be Marxist or anything resembling that at that time.
I think that is clearly right in the immediate background in the story, and I thank you for that. Like, I just want to, like, the history of the church and the government in Russia, if you don't know, is incredibly convoluted, interconnected, and like more or less Byzantine, in the bad sense of that word. And like, there are times where the Tsar essentially became the head of the church by force, like kind of got rid of the actual proper Russian bishop and formed a sort of puppet panel of, clergy that he could directly control. The history of religion in Russia and government is unimaginably different from where we come from. So I think I wish I could give more details where they come up importantly in the story. Maybe we can try to go into that a little bit more. I think what you can see already in this chapter, though, is you have all these people. Like, it's worth remembering anytime you hear someone who's a landowner, that's basically someone who used to have serfs, and they still, even though the serfs are emancipated, they're still getting income from people working that land for them, so it's more like I don't know if it's like a sharecropping scenario or whatever, but it's something like that. Like, they're technically not slaves, but you're still earning income just by owning land and doing nothing because you got other people working it for you. And so I think that is important, just because people like Miasov, it says he's very liberal, yet he also has a giant estate giving him all this income so he can run around Europe and kind of pretend to be in the action at the revolution in Paris and stuff like that. It's a little bit ironic,
Yeah, that was something you said when you and I went for a walk and we were talking about this that I hadn't thought of, was that like 19th century, just the fact that Musav can like go off and hang out in France and like, I'm just going to be part of the French Revolution for a while. Like, clearly he's incredibly wealthy, because as a Russian, you don't just hop on a train and go to France, right? Like, that's a key that he's really, really rich. I don't know. That helped me understand him.
Can I add something to that? It's just a completely weird historical. Transportation from Russia was so bad that in the time period in which this is written, it took longer. Like, when they had the major Grandmaster tournament in London in the 1850s and 60s, people could get to London from America faster than they could get there from Russia.
Oh, wow.
Now they could go by boat, that helps.
Like, just to think about that, like that you could not, like, none of the Russian Grandmasters could ever participate in major tournaments in France and in England because they could never get there on time.
So I'll resubmit my topic if no one else has anything immediate on what did you find funny in this section, if anything.
For me, nothing really like specific stands out, but just the author's tone in general, when talking about people, and, well, like I said before, about kind of relating to people, and kind of everybody does that. Wasn't exactly laugh out loud funny, but like, I think has a sense of humor about it.
I totally agree with that. Like, there's a tone to the narrator that's, and it's it's maybe worth asking the question: is Dostoevsky the narrator himself, or is this a separate character that he's created? And I'm inclined to go with the latter, but I think it actually gets confused whose voice it is as the book goes on. But in any case, like, he's speaking like this kind of half-educated provincial, like he speaks kind of awkwardly, you know?
Well, multiple times he talks about how the brothers came to our village. So I've often thought it's some sort of persona, because he's always like, they showed up in our village, they hung out in our town, right?
Yeah, I noticed the same.
And sorry, go ahead, Jenny.
I just said I noticed the same thing. I was disagreeing.
Oh, okay.
I thought it was an external person there who has some ability to make these philosophical musings. Like, he's telling the story, and then all of a sudden he's like going in depth about realism versus miracles, and like that made me. That's where I laughed. I was laughing when I had to reread it a couple of times. I was like, wait, are you serious right now? This is incredible.
Yeah, the miracles thing jumped out at me. Sorry, check 1 2. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
This time? Fabulous. What a surprise. Yeah, the miracles thing jumped out at me just because, there's obviously a long philosophical history of sort of apologetics and conversation and skepticism about miracles. And that one seemed like pretty specifically David Hume's arguments about miracles. But it made me wonder about the character of the narrator. Based on our conversation last time, we talked about, placing people on this spectrum between, for lack of better words, authentic Orthodox Russian versus corrupted Western liberal, as one of the ways to plot people, and trying to figure out where the narrator is supposed to stand is a sort of interesting project. It's a through line I'm looking forward to sort of following throughout the book. Right now he talks about being provincial. He's familiar with philosophy. He has kind of an ironic attitude towards, well, everybody. And I tend to associate irony with corrupted, decadent liberal. But that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of irony in a lot of Orthodox traditions.
I see Aaron looking around like,
Yeah.
What did I do?
Come on, we all know you're a corrupt liberal.
Jason, that was really well said. I'm glad you brought that up. And I think we should just kind of earmark that, like, let's pay attention and ask that question. I would sort of add my little rider onto that question. Are there moments where Dostoevsky breaks character and interjects instead of this provincial character? I think there might be, but we can debate that, and I would submit that realism moment might be one of those moments. And I think maybe we'll have to do a little more research on Dostoevsky's life and then introduce some biographical notes here and there where relevant. But
I agree. I agree with the idea about seeing the liberal versus the whatever voice. I also think it's important to try to think about the idea of to break it down further, the idea of the forces within the church that want to be reformed versus not reformed. Like the idea of, monastic versus the institution, or the idea of reformers within the church, the institution, because there are many times he makes the references about the distinctions of liturgy and the distinctions of people who follow different traditions and what that means and how that relates them to the authority. So it always seems like the narrator goes out of his way to show that there are factions also within those extremes as well. It sounds like he's trying to give us I've always felt he's trying to give us a nuanced, because he obviously doesn't want to be completely sympathetic with any side, otherwise he wouldn't be critiquing all of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. He really definitely makes that clear in the Elders chapter. Like, there's multiple viewpoints on this subject. It's controversial, I'll answer one of my own question here on something that I found funny. I really love, and this is probably to me the most colorful moment in this whole section that we read, is when Alyosha goes to ask his father permission to go to the monastery. And he's half drunk at the time. And he goes on this weird Trump-like rambling, nonsensical diatribe that goes all over the place, but basically ends up with him getting fixated on whether there is a ceiling in hell and whether there are hooks that are going to drag him down. And I find that section pretty hilarious. Like, well, wait, are there hooks? There have to be hooks, because otherwise who's going to drag a sinner like me down? You know, like, and he even quotes, is it Voltaire or someone? He's like, if there aren't hooks, they'd have to be invented, you know, just because of how bad I am. That phrase, by the way, will be echoed later in other characters. So, anyone else find that part funny? No? Okay. I found that hilarious.
I found it really
It's
weird.
hilarious. I don't know why anyone wouldn't find it funny. I mean, just because it's funny because on one hand it's blasphemous, but on the other hand it does a really good job of being ironic because it's showing the blasphemer to be both pathetic and also onto something in his blasphemy. And like that's what's so amazing.
Well, I love Fyodor. He's one of my favorite characters. He's, you know, by far one of the most colorful characters. And what you mentioned is kind of interesting because I think he manages to be like a terrible person, but also to kind of like he is somehow literate still in like biblical language and the liturgy and all this stuff. Like when his first wife dies and he goes run through the streets, he's actually quoting a biblical verse that's used in Vespers every single service in the Orthodox Church. Lord, now let us, thou thy servant, depart in peace. It's just sort of ironic that you have this guy who is clearly not religious whatsoever, and yet his life and language is really sprinkled with these religious references, and that goes on, I think, throughout the story. I think sometimes Dostoevsky is sort of making fun of Russianness in general, and he'll say, "Here's something particularly Russian, you know all this stuff, like you're a total goofball, but you still are gonna like, and you're living your life like a terrible person, but you're suddenly gonna decide, I want to make a donation to the church to pray for my first wife's soul. You know, I don't really believe in this stuff, but it's inner contradictions like that I think he enjoys sort of smiling at, you know."
Do you think the jabs at being Russian is a little bit of just the self-hatred in general? Like, I mean, I don't know. I was just curious because, you know, because it's obviously that he's a Francophile, as the Russian intellectuals of that time were. So I often wondered, you know, like, it's almost as if you're a Francophile and a Russian intellectual, it's almost that you have to know your backwards, otherwise you're not in on the joke, if you get my meaning. Like, you know, like how great the French are in order to know how backwards Russians are in general, and the only way you show you're enlightened is by acknowledging how backward Russians are.
You're on
That-
mute. Melissa.
You have no sound, Melissa. We'll come back to that. Technical difficulties. Sorry, guys.
Right.
I think
Someone else can chime in.
I don't know about anything. I'm not a Russian expert at all, but both of those things seem to be very just universally human things. You know, Anglicans, Romans, they do the same things as far as, you know. So I don't know how much of that is uniquely Russian as far as like praying for someone and being, you know, horribly abysmal, or, you know, being from somewhere terrible but being in on the joke. Like those are just those seem like uniquely not just human things. Oh, we lost Melissa.
No.
Yeah, I think I agree about them being human things, but not sure how to say this. It also seems to be very human to take something that's widespread and think it's just you. Like for Russia to be like, oh, this is a Russian thing. And then other people to be like, no, that's everybody.
Absolutely. I left for beer. Are we still laughing at things?
The floor is
Sure.
open.
What else did you laugh at?
When the line, you go to the elder to find freedom, attain perfect freedom from yourself. I laughed a great deal at that. Enslaving yourself essentially for some sort of, intertemporal reward later. I just like the irony in that. It made me laugh out loud when I read the line.
I don't think that was supposed to be funny.
Was that the one about how you can only be completely free to make your own choices if you completely obey somebody else?
It was in that time period when they're talking about the elder, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think, I don't know much about, again, as I said, Russian and this stuff. I know that all the existentialists and absurdists that I've read were influenced by him. And so it seems like a first step that some of them were taking, talking about freedom and what it is to be human. Are you making your own decisions? Where does definition for mankind come from? So it made me laugh out loud to read that. Talking about a pursuit of freedom being, you're externalizing it and then just enslaving yourself with something else.
Well, this is one of the open questions about the institution of eldership. Is it just some guy on a power trip? Or is it actually a spiritual path that leads to some kind of astounding results? And that's definitely a question that is not being answered one way or the other in this chapter or section. What I will say is that within the context of Orthodoxy and Russia, among that, in Russia, it's sort of contentious and factional at this particular time because they had lost this institution. But as it mentions, in the rest of the Orthodox world, this was not uncommon or weird, and continues to this day with the exact sorts of reactions described by the pilgrims who are coming in groups to confess and so forth. So there's a real pious and there's a strong, belief in the spiritual transformation and power of these types of figures. I actually kind of feel like this chapter does a small disservice to the idea because it focuses so much on the authority and submitting entirely to another person's authority that it almost glosses over why would you do that and how could that? It just seems kind of insane, I think, from the outside. And I don't think that the chapter, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your guys' reaction. Does it just, I'm guessing most of you it struck as more or less insane.
well, the line to obtain absolute or perfect freedom or whatever he said, I mean, like that you don't need more than those three words to make an incredible point, if that's what the objective is. I mean, when you talk about you guys, can I just ask, am I the only not Orthodox person in this group?
No.
No? Okay. Just curious.
Actually, to the contrary, I'm the only Orthodox person present
Okay.
at the moment. I'm sorry, Michael's here. I forgot you're here because you're not talking. And we have one other of Chris's friends. I'm blanking. Bradamar, what's her name? Anyway, she may join us for future. There's possibly 3 Orthodox people in the group.
Talking about Emmy.
Yeah, Emmy. Yeah. She is meant to participate. I don't think she could just couldn't make it tonight. We're happy to, I'm happy to chime in and offer, like, well, here's my perspective as someone coming from the spiritual tradition if you have questions, but I really don't want to domineer, like, this is how you should interpret it, you know, because the author, I think, goes out of his way to not take sides in it. Like, I think the whole thing is meant so you can make up your own mind given the evidence of how people behave over the course of the story. So, but if you have questions like, well, this seems weird, I'm happy to try to give some background.
I think to jump back a moment, the question of like whether it seems insane to take this leap towards the elders, I think they actually do, or the narrator, Dostoevsky, does a very good job in this section describing Alyosha's decision to go to the monastery to make it plausible. And so I think that the question, or at least the question as it's raised here, is not why would you do this, or why, or is it an authentic choice, or is it just a con? But it is commitment to this life one arbitrary possible way of committing your life among many, or is it or is there something special about it? They say for Alyosha that it could have just as easily been socialism or atheism, and if he had picked one of those, he would have committed himself wholeheartedly. And I think it actually ties into the humor of the thing, the feel of the humor in this and in a lot of essays about it, but I think especially in this is sort of Woody Allen-y, where it's this world that's just populated by neurotics. Just everybody is wandering around, just like in their own head, trying to figure out, just constantly trying to figure out what they're supposed to do next, just in agony over it, and somehow that ends up, being kind of comic when all of these people bump into each other, and I think it has something to do with, Aaron mentioned kind of the existentialist perspective, and that's kind of how I come at it too. Mostly loving French people who loved German people who loved this, but this question of performance, and the way that characters like Fyodor, or like the woman who kills herself to try to be like Ophelia, like they are comfortable, or they're fulfilled or happy only when they have a role to play, when they feel that they have a place, and I think it's an open question, at least as of this chapter, whether commitment to an ideal like the church or like socialism is just one of those roles that can potentially kind of give you arbitrary comfort, or if there's something real there. That was kind of the piece that jumped out to me the most. Fyodor is not the only one who loves play acting here. Everyone does.
Jason, that's incredible, man. I think you're just nailing like the themes to watch as the book unfolds, and definitely freedom and the need to give away your to sign up for something, and kind of give yourself over to it is absolutely going to be revisited in future.
Well, it's the theme of the work. Remember, what he writes as the theme of the work is John 10:10. Is that it? Unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies. Because that's what, even in the book itself, Dostoevsky says this is the theme.
Yeah, I think it's just worth underlining that and being like, well, we don't have very much to work with yet, but absolutely he's already starting to visit that one, and I think you stated that absolutely beautifully, Jason.
The Woody Allen thing.
Yeah, it's also definitely.
Beautiful.
I mean, you've already noticed that everyone's crazy. Everyone's crazy in Dostoevsky. Everybody.
Except for maybe one. I would argue that there's a character in this, but he was crazy. I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but there is a character who I believe is not crazy, but admits that he was at one point.
Well, we'll have to visit that when we can.
But I think noticing that there is one exception is important to that. I really do.
Okay. Yeah. There's a whole lot of craziness though, and I know when Melissa taught this book, one of the other professors she was teaching it with was like, I just can't believe, I don't find any of these characters believable. They're all completely insane. And we both kind of looked at each other and were like, that's funny because you actually are one of the characters in this book, ma'am. Like,
That's the old, like, everyone thinks their family's crazy, and if they don't, they're the one who's crazy. That's the...
I think I would find crazy characters more believable.
well, you're gonna have no trouble believing this book. I do think that Dostoevsky probably is one of the first significant authors to really nail and understand the very irrational side of human nature, you know, like, and to explore that intentionally and really profoundly. How people do weird things they don't understand themselves, even to their own harm, for no apparent reason, you know. And it mentions that with Fyodor already. Like, he sometimes just decides to act a role, even to his like own detriment, and he just goes along with this role that he forces himself into. You know, like when Miasov comes and takes Dmitri away from him, he acts like he doesn't know what kid they're talking about. Like, wait, I have a son?
Yeah, I think too, it's important when you say Dostoevsky really hits human nature. Even Nietzsche said he's the only psychologist with anything to say.
That's partly why I really enjoy the book, even when it's not really hitting on plot points, because it's almost always exploring someone's, you know, mind, and it's always kind of entertaining.
I didn't notice that there wasn't plot. I was just like, he's painting these beautiful pictures of people, and I was just sitting back, like, looking at that happen. So I don't get that it's boring or anything like that at this point.
And it's lots and lots of people. I mean, in these 3 chapters, like, we've already got portraits of side characters who are dead and gone for the rest of the book, you know. So it's it's amazing how everyone's mother dies every single time, and then everyone that they're with next dies, and they're orphaned like 3 times.
Like the backstory of every Disney movie rolled into one.
And they are half brothers too, and that just helps.
Melissa, are you back? Can you hear everyone?
I can hear. Can you hear me?
Hey, I can now.
Yay!
Would you like to share the point you were trying to make a ways back?
Oh, I don't know if I remember. Oh, I think I was just trying to say that I don't think that Dostoevsky is a full-on Francophile, and it's hard to talk about that yet, but he makes as much fun of people who are obsessed with European and French culture as he does Russians. And I feel like, too, like, this gets to the point we were all making about elders, is like, he, like, I get that existentialists love him, but he's not. Like, he's just so hard to pin down. His ideas are so complex because he ends up making fun of everybody. Like, I feel like that's one of the things that, without a spoiler, I can say, like, as we go on, you're like, oh, he's so making fun of this group of people, and he's going to turn around and make fun of the next. So that was all I was trying to say, was like, nah, like, we're going to see in the next chapter, he's going to take us some swings at the people who are, like, obsessed with French and European culture and think that's the height of all things. Like, I don't think he's fully ashamed of being Russian. So that was what I was trying to say, but I feel that feels like so far back.
No,
I also wanted to answer your first question. That a thing that happened in this chapter that I thought was funny was when the woman shows up and just starts slapping people in the face. I thought that was really funny. She's
I love
just like, you suck, I'm taking these orphans. Like, that was hilarious. Anyway.
I did like that the servant took it. I was thinking of like Woodhouse and Archer, kind of a.
Yeah, totally. That's so right. We did a roll call here on Orthodox Christians. I just want to do a roll call real quick on how many philosophers we have, or who have spent significant time reading philosophy.
Define that.
Yeah.
You're one of them, Aaron.
Okay.
So I know Jason and David actually are in a philosophy discussion group.
Yep, former philosophy major.
And then Micah, it seems like you're pretty saturated too.
Mike is on mute. He protests this question.
No, not at all. I'd like to say I'm a recovering philosophy major. Unfortunately, I did finish. But the funny thing was I went to literature to try to get away from philosophy and want to get more into beauty, but then they just tried to bombard me with postmodernism, and I couldn't get away. So it was, but no, I thought that point about Dostoevsky not being a Francophile, I think it's a good point. I just think that, I guess what I meant is that at that point the intellectual elite of Russia was Francophilic, right? Like couldn't be an yeah. So. And
that's where I really want to hang on to that question and talk about it, because it was something that always came up when I taught this book, that like he's deliberately going to engage with that issue. Like, that's where I feel like he's not unreflective. Can you not hear me again?
No, I hear you.
Okay.
It's amazing how he can simultaneously be praising and constantly critiquing rationalism. I always thought that was amazing. With Dostoevsky, narrow is the gate.
I want to point out another moment I thought was funny that's exactly on this topic, actually. When he's talking about how Ivan managed to work his way through college, basically, with some clever articles and stuff. And then the narrator goes in this little side diatribe, which I highly suspect reflects Dostoevsky's opinion of the majority of students who go around knocking on every publisher's door, just being like, can I copy something or translate something from French? He's like, I have nothing of my own.
Yeah, actually, kind of a not thematic, but just I didn't necessarily understand something question. He does not tell us on what side of the issue of ecclesiastical courts Ivan writes on, right? He doesn't say it explicitly.
That's a very good observation and will be explored further. It will be part of a pretty extensive dialogue. And Ivan's mysterious, So no, we definitely don't know.
I wanted to ask a question of something that I've always wondered, and just something to think about, because they talk about how they're half brothers, but it is important that only Dmitri and Ivan and Dmitri and Alyosha are half brothers, but Ivan and Alyosha are brothers, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So I wondered if that's intentional, if there's some kind of thematic, if there's anything going to be thematic. I've always wanted to pay close attention, since I'm doing this, reading this for I don't know how many times, to say, is there anything similar about Alyosha and Ivan and how they're mysterious? And I wonder if them being full, the fact that they are, I mean, I know Alyosha has no less affection for Dmitri, but I always thought it was interesting, the idea, why that distinction, and the idea, I always wondered if that's something to watch for in terms of how maybe Ivan and Alyosha may be similar in some ways. I was just something I've always thought about.
Yeah. And just as a full disclosure, I've been rereading this and I'm on page 500 something. So I can say that there are a few scenes where I do think that gets looked at a little bit. And just to make one of my repeat points about things to watch for in this book and how it's structured, like I said, so much is not so plot driven, although you get a pretty exciting plot, but so much is about character contrasts and the ways that different characters inhabit similar crises, like how they react differently. And I think that Ivan and Alyosha actually have a lot in common. But it'll be really interesting to watch them explore some of the same ideas and how they wrestle with them. So that's, I can only speak. It's unfortunate. We're so at the beginning, we don't have a lot to talk about, but that's worth watching for.
We've had not a lot to talk about for over an hour, though, so we're doing okay.
On which note, we've tried to, I guess I'm trying to set this up with an hour-long discussion as the general target. If we want to go longer, if people want to stay on, we can. But if anyone wants to wrap things up at this point, you're certainly welcome to go. We are over an hour in. But if you guys want to keep talking, I'm not going to cut things off,
I got to duck out. My wife has been asleep for half an hour already. But this is wonderful. Thank you guys so much.
Cheers,
Thanks,
sir.
Jason.
Yeah, thanks, man. Great points. And I think everyone got the reading schedule. So we'll stick to that for now. So next week we'll do.
Do that for me.
But I'm happy to keep talking for a while if some other people want to stick around.
I mean, I have 5-6 of a beer here, so.
I want to keep talking, but I live with you, so I don't feel like I'm an important vote right now. We'll talk one way or another.
Well, those of us who'd like to keep talking, let's stick around. I'm going to open the forum up completely for observations, questions, anything you guys want to talk about. Just jump in. I'm going to stop directing and responding to every single comment and let other people have a conversation.
Can we talk about Dmitri? We've talked about Ivan and Alyosha a bunch, but we've barely talked about Dmitri, and I want to talk about Dmitri because I love all of them. That's all. I just want to talk about Dmitri.
Okay, start.
Well, I just think okay, so we've talked about how there's this he's representative of passions and he's so angry about a lot, but I don't know, I find him really interesting. I find him really relatable, even though he's like a drunken, angry soldier, which is a weird thing for me to say I find relatable. David, did you just laugh at me? You just laughed at me.
Yep.
I wasn't prepared. I just wanted to talk about him. I'll find something. Hold on.
Anyone have a Dmitri comment while she looks for something?
I would just say in general that it was kind of fascinating to me how easily, at least in this first chapter, relationships seem to be broken and then mended, how easily people could hate each other but still go back to their dad and start having a relationship with him again after however many years. And maybe it's just because so many years passed in that one chapter that it seems easier than it actually would be over the course of a decade or two. But it was just yeah, I hate you. You abandoned me. I'm not going to talk to you ever again. actually, I'm gonna go home and like live with you again. I don't know. That was interesting.
I think that's a great point. In a book this thick, it kind of reads like a campfire tale that way. Where, like, you'd think there'd be some like detailed, like we sat down in the bar, we hashed this out. There's like some details, but it's just great. We're there now.
Yeah.
I mean, it reads like Old Testament or like a something like that, you know.
It does so far, and what I hear you saying is, Dostoevsky, I wish you wrote an even bigger book. I do.
Well, I think springing off of what you just said, David, is like so both or now I can't remember if Aaron or David said it, but it's like both Ivan and Alyosha just kind of show up and are back in their father's life. And Dmitri's been painted for us as this like wastrel and a scoundrel, and he's a drunk soldier. But I think partly why I connect to him is like, well, of course he's pissed. His dad like lied to him. He's the only one that grew up thinking he had some amount of money. He got cheated out of it. And like, so I feel like on the one hand, he's being set up as this kind of rogue, but on the other hand, he's the only one that makes sense to me. Like Alyosha and Ivan are just like, yeah, cool, I'll live with you, Dad, whatever. Whereas Dmitri's like, no, man, you like cheated me. I don't know, like his anger makes sense to me. So I feel like even if he's representative of passions or anger or the stuff, like it's an anger that makes sense. Like who wouldn't be mad if you found out that your dad had like run you through this elaborate swindle so that you used up your property without using it up? Like, I don't know. I feel like from the beginning, he's both like Fyodor. He's like kind of a jackass and also very sympathetic in a way. Like, of course he's this way. Like we read about how you were saying he got bounced to like 4 different orphan, like, you know, people kept forgetting him or dying and he just got passed around. And anyway, I don't know that I have any good points about Dmitri. I just felt like we hadn't really said anything about him, and he's just as important as the other brothers, but I do think like his anger is a really important difference. For some reason, Alyosha and Ivan aren't pissed. Dmitri's pissed, but it kind of makes sense to me.
I agree. I think it's actually the most natural reaction to the circumstance they're all in. Although I do think Dostoevsky explores that idea because the narrator spends a significant amount of time wondering why in the hell Ivan came back.
Mm-hmm.
The whole town's like, what is he doing here? This makes no sense. And they get along? What? And the narrator also spends a lot of time explaining how Alyosha gets along with everyone and never gets injured or upset. So the real mystery is Ivan.
Well, don't you think that the contrast of Dmitri in how he relates to Fyodor compared to his brothers is about the greater theme of, because you got to remember that in this time, in this culture, father, you know, because every son, his middle name is his father's name. So like revering your father and obeying your father is expected in the culture. So on one hand, I'm not sure the culture isn't, even if your father's a bastard, that you're not just supposed to revere him and take it. I mean, maybe I'm wrong there. So in that sense, it seems to me that it's also setting up the idea of what is one's duty to one's father as well. And so, sure, obviously Dmitri has every right to be pissed, but the question is he also the only one who's bucking the system, the society? And that, of course, is going to set him up, as everyone who's read it knows how that sets him up. But to me, it's the question of, I think it's trying to ask the question simultaneously. And the reason why it doesn't explain those things is I think it's trying to ask the question, what is a son in addition to what is a father? Because I think it's important because Alyosha can like Fyodor because he likes everybody, even though he doesn't have to revere him as a father or as a father figure because he has one. And I think Ivan is the one where we're supposed to wonder what the hell is going on. Is it because they're both kind of slippery individuals and so they can get along, or is there something else going on with Ivan that we will never understand? I feel like the sympathy for Dmitri is really, really important simply because it's setting us up for like the central rising, falling action in the events of the book.
While we're on this subject, wanted to share one of my other favorite lines that I thought was pretty funny. This is the beginning of chapter 2, The First Son Sent Packing. It's talking about Dmitri after this portrait of Fyodor. Of course, one can imagine what sort of father and mentor such a man would be. As a father, he did precisely what was expected of him. That is, he totally and utterly abandoned his child. I thought that was a pretty striking and funny line.
I'm gonna tap out here. I think I got kids up running around. I believe because I can hear them screaming. And if you've done this, please send it or point me to it. But I'm not terribly familiar with most of you, and so if you wanted to do this by voice or by email, I don't care. But I'd really like to know, in a couple lines, something about who you are and where you come from, educational background, religious affiliation. Just a basic sketch, so I have an idea of sort of any expertise you might have as we go through this book.
That's something we should all spread around to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we'll start with that next time. We did actually do that in the first meeting. For those of you who weren't on that one, I
missed it.
Link.
I missed it as well.
I actually do have the first discussion video, and we kind of went over, here's some things to look for, themes. We just kind of asked everybody, what is your, once you're familiar with Dostoevsky and what does that name do for you? But anyway, I'll make sure I share that. I should have done that already. And for those like you, Bradamire, and Aaron, and Micah, and maybe we'll just do it again next week real quick.
Well, we could also think about, I don't know, it sounded like people were asking to email it maybe, because then you don't have to watch through the whole video. If people are going to be jumping in and out, it could be kind of an evolving document or something. I don't know if that's what people were saying.
I like his couple of points. He was
so yeah, submit like a 3-line
a 3-line bio.
Yeah.
The first 3 lines of your CV. Yeah.
Oh God. Aaron, not everyone has a CV.
What? Are you
not
sure?
everyone has a CV.
What's
get out of the tower.
But yeah, thanks, Bradamire. Thanks for joining us. I'm really glad you're in, and looking forward to doing it again.
Well, hopefully my book shows up on Tuesday like it's supposed to, and I'll have actually read by next time.
I figured there'd be a few people in this situation still, which is why we only read the first exposition introduction section before any real story happens. So,
well, thanks for having me. I got to get going, so you guys have a good one.
Cheers. Melissa left. I'm just staying on until Taggy talks, basically. So I'll be here till 3.
You get a whiskey?
Yeah, I'm gonna get a whiskey.
All right, Melissa's gonna get a whiskey from back here.
Wow.
Ooh, nice.
Breaking the 70-second wall or something.
Okay, so I was just flipping through to see if I had anything else that jumped out at me. And on the very last page of what we read about the elders, when they're talking about the night before they're all going to get together, and who was it? Was it Alyosha, I think? Yeah, Alyosha sends a letter to Dmitri about keeping his promise. And it says, Dmitri thought for a moment because he couldn't recall what he had promised. Do we as readers know what he promised? Because I couldn't figure it out. Or is it ambiguous on purpose?
I actually wondered the same thing when I reread that today. I was like, did I miss something? I forget if he made a promise. Other than to show up. I don't think he did. I think Alyosha just meant show up, please.
Okay.
I think.
That would make sense. I just wanted to know if I missed something.
I'm pretty sure that's what it was, because doesn't it also say that Alyosha's only confident that Dmitri's the one who he knows will behave himself?
The only one who will what? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Behave himself. who will show the appropriate, not being a total blasphemous or completely, So I think he just wants one member of his family to be there who won't be a total, complete embarrassment.
Yeah, because he says like, oh, Ivan's just going for curiosity, so's Musov, but Dmitri might actually take. Like, it's funny. Again, it's funny because Dmitri's the angry. Like, he doesn't strike me as a religious person. He's angry, drunk soldier guy, but he has some room to take Father Zosima seriously, whereas the intellectual, upright citizens are just going to come and sneer. I think is Alyosha's fear that we hear at the end of that book.
I think it's important to note that when the critics say that Dmitri represents the passions, and you're right, that's a bit of it's too much of a generalization, but it's not just in a bad way. It's also the good things, nobility, because he can be both rash, but he can also be honorable. He has a certain sense of self-importance and pride, but he also has a certain sense of honor and obedience and a certain sense of giving credit where credit is due. So I feel like all of the good things about the passions are represented in Dmitri as well. The problem is that they go up and down so fast.
Yeah, and I mean, it's hard to know that at this point in the book, but that's certainly going to be true.
Well, it's hard because that's where I'm not Orthodox, but I've been in this Orthodox world long enough. Like, passions is such a loaded term. I think for a non-Orthodox reader, you hear he represents passions. I don't know, right? Like, McGee, you could do better with this, or here, this is where Taggy could talk. Like, somebody Orthodox could explain, like, just when I hear someone representing the passions are not really a good thing in the Orthodox world, right?
Well, I didn't, when I was using because the critic who famously made that distinction, he didn't mean it in an Orthodox way. He was a atheistic structuralist.
Okay, when I hear passion versus the passions, I'm always like, is that an Orthodox thing?
Like, Dmitri is the calm rather than, so okay. Did not mean in the Orthodox sense of passions.
Though I would submit that it's still pertinent to the discussion, in that they're definitely exploring those ideas in these characters and in the world of the elders and so forth, and what exactly would you go to a monastery for anyway? I think it's a great point to remember Dmitri also has the high points and the high end and the good side of it. And but yeah, there's a certain reticence about, like, in the Orthodox religious view, passions are any time you lose control of yourself to some sort of impulse, basically. And those may be good or bad, but the fact that you're being pushed around by something is questionable.
Does that imply that it's a metaphysical push, like the devil's doing it, that kind of a thing?
No, it's simply it's a question of ordering of the soul, even in a classical sense, almost.
Okay.
Which part is in control here? Is it the rational part, the decision-making part that represents the person making choices to a good end? Or is this something compelling me more like an addiction?
Okay, okay. That makes sense.
And could there be metaphysical elements in the discussion? Yeah, they certainly are, but it doesn't depend on that by any means. It's kind of like giving over to something, and it's certainly what you see Dmitri, like a lot of the characters have that flaw.
This can be a broken human nature kind of a thing.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, so basically, since I was simplifying a much more like complex point that scholars make, I should have just said mind, body, soul. That's what because that's really how the critics like to divide it: mind, body, soul. So
I like this discussion we're having about the passions, though, because I do feel like we were talking about, one of the questions with the elder is it ever good to give yourself over to something? Is that ever a form of freedom? And I feel like now that the way you just phrased that, McGee, that like one Orthodox understanding of the passions is you give yourself over to something. I feel like that circles back to some of the points Jason was making earlier, just like this question of, And that's where we're getting to some of these existential questions. Like, is anyone ever really free, or are you just choosing what to give yourself over to? Because if you start to believe that we're all just giving ourselves over to something, it might be the passions, it might be an elder, like that makes it seem much less crazy, right? Like if your choice is to give yourself over to a political system or a religious system or your own crazy self, like why not? I just feel like I got excited hearing you phrase it that way, because I feel like that's a question that we can kind of track through the rest of the novel. Like, are there, like, is Dostoevsky, like existentialists love him so much, but is he really talking about people's ability to be free, or is he exploring this idea that like we all end up choosing to be loyal or give ourselves over to something? I'm not, I don't honestly know. I'm rereading, I'm going to pay attention to that, but just the way you phrase that, I was like, oh, that's a cool connection. Is like, I feel like, and that helps explain the idea of an elder, I think, to people who aren't familiar with the Orthodox world, is maybe there's this worldview of like, you're going to give yourself over to something and you can choose, would you want it to be drugs or a religious person like that? Well, that sounded weird, but you know what I mean? Like
That doesn't that doesn't contradict existentialism. I mean, you can. It's just that you have the freedom to do that.
I think it does render the decision a little more intelligible to do something like join a monastery and completely submit yourself to the authority of an elder. Because the goal there, which is the line that Aaron laughed at, is to actually become free from yourself, to become free of and what it means there, I think, is more the sense of the passions, the things that I may feel are part of my character, but are really just things tugging me all over the place. It may not be my true self. That's what I'm trying to find. Like when you take away all my compulsions, all my distractions, my needs to, make a little switch light up in my brain or whatever, then where am I? What if we unplug from the addictions, so to speak?
I should say, McG, I wasn't laughing because I think it's stupid. I was laughing because I think it's like such a foreshadowing into like the absurd of like, I'm just grabbing at something.
Well, yeah, and I think that's this is totally a central theme of the book. Like, it's going to explore this freedom. Is there freedom? Can people make their own choices? It's going to explore that from every angle.
and I think Micah brought up like the epigraph of the book, which to me, that was another point I think I wanted to make when my microphone like was that like we have this epigraph saying like, unless a grain of corn dies, whatever, I can't quote it, but
unless a corn of wheat fall to the ground and die, it beareth no fruit.
So that to me is like, what's so interesting is, where does paradox become absurdity, right? Like there's this really paradoxical sense. Maybe giving your freedom over to someone as a way to be free is absurd, or maybe it's a paradoxical, brilliant truth. Like I really feel like that's another line that the novel's going to skate, like, and you don't know for so long where it's going to fall. Like, is this stupid or is this like religious genius? Like that same tension that's there, like living to die, giving up all your freedom to actually find freedom. Either that's going to be great or it's going to be really stupid. Like
And I think it'll be awesome when we get to read in the Meditations of Zosima, particularly at the end, the part called the Russian Monk, which for many scholars is like the central part of the novel. Like a lot of scholars think like that very short section called the Russian Monk is like the most important part of the novel in terms of tying everything together thematically. I always thought that that's the real question is like, and I'm only bringing this up because I know we can't get there because I haven't read it yet, but the real relationship I really believe about freedom, and the question is, are we free, is the fundamental idea is love what makes us free, or is love what makes us a slave, or does it matter? Because I really think that's what it's after. Because I feel like ultimately that is going to be the key idea. Because like, I don't think Dostoevsky in this novel ever wants us to talk about freedom without talking about love and what it means to love something, or what it means for something to enslave you.
Well, and that may be because there's certainly discussions or movements of people trying to do exactly that, freedom without love, that come up and maybe get contrasted with other views. I wanted to read a line that I found that's very much on topic here. This is page 30, about 2/3 of the way down, talking about Alyosha, who has no question why they loved the elder so much, the peasants. And here's what it says. Oh, how well he understood that for the humble soul of the simple Russian, worn out by toil and grief, and above all by everlasting injustice and everlasting sin, his own and the world's, here we go. There is no stronger need and consolation than to find some holy thing or person to fall down before him and venerate him. And for those of you who have already read the book, that sounds awfully, that echoes Grand Inquisitor type stuff in a big way, big foreshadowing in my opinion. But like this need to fall down before someone, right?
But also, if you read just a little bit more, like this is another one of those moments where I don't know, like that need to fall down before someone sounds suspect. But then this idea, though with us there is sin, unrighteousness, and temptation, still all the same. There is on earth in such and such a place somewhere, someone holy and exalted. He has the truth. He knows the truth. Like that to me is not a bad impulse, is like the desire to find a good thing or see a good person or like believe that even if your life is a total piece of crap, that there's some higher purpose.
Yeah, and I certainly wasn't making that that point. I'm highlighting a line.
And I think that's also really important in understanding the author, because Dostoevsky did say, if I had to choose between Christ and truth, I would still choose Christ. And I'm not saying that to be an anti-Dostoevsky thing. It's that he does need there to be that thing ultimately to go to, an absolute good that somehow can make up for all the shit, so to speak. Pardon my language. I don't know if anyone doesn't like that word, but I feel like that's the
We have no language restrictions in this.
Well, if it's gonna, well, at least not maybe for the YouTube parts, but.
I'd like to throw out one other piece of biographical background that maybe is helpful to be aware of, which is that Dostoevsky himself had visited the Optina monastery that he mentioned in this chapter, one of the places where elders were strong and already had a long tradition. And he met one of these elders who had the gift of discernment that he describes, where people would walk in the room without saying a word. The elder would start saying, "You've come for this reason, and here's what you should do about this problem. This is what's on your heart, isn't it?" You know, and just give him the answer. So Dostoevsky was very struck by that. He had a personal experience with elders in his own life, and I think that's just worth mentioning. He's been to a monastery and met a guy like the kind that he's describing, and the portrait of Zosima is in some ways based off the elder Ambrose of Optina and a few other saints before him. So it's like just worth knowing that he'd been and met such a guy.
Well, and if I remember right, he was at Optina after his son died, after his 2-year-old son died. So not just that he went, but he went at a point when he was very, very much actively wrestling with questions of how do you make meaning out of incredible suffering or the seeming lack of meaning in the world.
I think that might even turn up in one of the footnotes in a chapter, because that is a great point to remember. You should bring that up in the relevant chapter. You know what I'm talking about, Melissa.
I will.
Taggy, say something.
So this book is his Eric Clapton Tears in Heaven. Is that what you're telling me?
I thought of the exact same thing when you said his 2-year-old son died.
I mean, among other things.
Virginia, I'm Aaron. You seem awesome. Just
Thank you. Call me Jenny.
Jimmy?
Jenny.
Jenny.
Short
Okay.
for Virginia.
I forgot, you guys might not have met.
No, not officially. Now we have.
You guys all got Taggy off the hook.
I
He's
could
not
see,
muted, though. He's ready to talk. I can see it.
I could see he was tagging, so I jumped in. Come on, Taggy, tell me something.
What do you want to know, Aaron?
I'm drinking a Coors. Remember how good they are?
Coors Banquet. That's the top choice.
Was that the one that came out number 1?
It was that in
believe so.
PBR.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those. I can't remember. It's all kind of hazy.
Feel like
We
17
did a terrible lager tasting last time we were all in Peoria. For those who might be wondering,
That's why I got a Coors out.
I'm gonna drink whiskey.
Good choice.
Aaron, my Pilsner can beat your Pilsner.
Yes, it can.
Just about any Pilsner can beat that Pilsner.
There were a couple of lines. This is while we're at a dead spot here, where you'd mentioned things that made me laugh. I remembered another one.
Yes, please.
Yes.
On page 32, it said a liberal of the 40s and 50s, a free thinker and an atheist. Miasov. It goes on, and I just laughed at how like it didn't matter if you wrote that now or in the 1900s or in the 1800s. Like how beautiful that is. That's like a 3 centuries timeless line.
Hey, we're setting up the 2040s and 2050s pretty well. Let's do it again. Another Great Depression, then we can have another wave of liberalism.
Yep.
Yeah.
Next generation of 30s and 40s free thinkers.
I think you'll find that Miasov is a perennial source of humor in this book.
I feel like I went to grad school with like 10 Miasovs. I find him so funny because, God.
As someone who just got out of grad school again, I will say that English departments are entirely filled with Miasovs. Like,
Yep.
you won't find anything but Miasov.
Except for me. You'll find me.
Well, and me too, but I was kind of the troll, so I lived under a bridge.
I play basketball twice a week with English department people, and I've had enough.
I'll fight you,
You have
Aaron.
no idea, bro. You have no idea. Talking to someone who had to defend his thesis politically because I didn't change the pronouns of people I was quoting. Not my pronouns that I was using in my words. But I did not change the pronouns of people I was quoting from the 19th. That made me not change their pronouns that they were using.
How dare you?
You're supposed to put in brackets, right? Like,
Well, you're supposed to put sick, and I did it once because I know that's the convention because I do want my stuff to be published, right? But I didn't keep doing it. They want to get people to keep doing it now. So that every time someone says man, M-A-N, to be the universal human being, they want you to put in brackets sick every time. And to me, that is the most preposterous nonsense thing. And the only reason why you would do that is you're literally trying to club people over the head ideologically repeatedly whenever you're quoting anyone from the past. And I wouldn't do it. I said I did it once. That's what the publicists asked for. I'm not doing it more than once.
Next, they'll want you to spell it S-I-C-K.
yeah, dude.
That's subtly the funniest thing anyone said all night, dude.
The thing is that like I'm not even sure if that's a joke.
He always does it. He comes in at the end and he just gets you.
That's what I do.
I'm a little sad no one else loved the hook section as much as I did. Melissa,
Well, I'll tell you what was funny to me.
I love the hook section, but my microphone didn't work, so I couldn't explain how much I love the hook section.
I could talk about the hook section forever because I love Voltaire, but I feel like I talked already. So
It's not just the hook section too. It's the fact that he like goes on this whole like rambling rant about whether or not the monks all have a secret brothel village, right? And then like he's like they have this village with tunnels that they go to, and there's a bunch of women in it. But man, they're only Russian women. They need some French women. Like this is one of those times where you're like, do people not realize how freaking profane? Like he's just rambling about. I don't know. I thought that part was pretty funny too. Where he's like, don't be too offended, Alyosha. They're just Russian women. It's not French women. They really should get some French women. Like that was. This guy's a mess.
that could be an actual Dostoevsky drunken rant, though. Like that's the marvelous thing. Like, because he would get extremely vulgar and blasphemous when he was drinking heavily. Like that's what's amazing about that, is he would get extremely vulgar when he would get drunk, because he was drunk a lot. I mean, a lot.
Well, isn't that Russian?
Even Dostoevsky had a certain level of excellence that few men could aspire to.
That's your whole excellence.
I like the story about the monk that blows out of his casket 3 times, like during the liturgy, during all the catechumens depart. That story, just thinking about that, made me laugh. Not so much the story itself, because it's like, well, it's like a legend or whatever, but just thinking about that, like that'd be really funny to like watch this like guy bust out his grave in the middle of the church service. And, like,
Yeah,
And then they had to call somebody else in to absolve him before they could actually bury him.
yeah,
right.
The coffin kept escaping.
Wasn't it the coffin that flew out?
Yeah.
yeah. The whole coffin flew
The
out.
whole coffin.
That's definitely another high point. I think it's especially funny if you've actually been to an Orthodox liturgy, because that happens in every single one. That
Flying coffin.
Yep, flying coffin.
Yeah, dude.
we have lots of crazy stuff happening. I don't know why.
Come visit us. You'll have a good time.
The thing is, if that really was a thing, I'm not sure I would know if I could choose to see a flying coffin or not. Would I? 'Cause I feel like if it's not a flying coffin, I feel like my whole life has to change, and I'm not sure exactly how.
Well, that's a theme in the book, sir, that you brought up, because there's actually quite a bit of reflection on miracle and faith and realism, right? And it's already been mentioned. And can miracles produce faith? And already in this section, it kind of talked about the realist and the believer and so forth. Realism will pop up as a word quite a bit in a lot of characters will talk about realism. They'll talk about miracles. It's going to be a central question in the book, actually. So pay attention on the miracle and could I believe? Would that change anything if I saw one? Like, it's definitely explored.
Well, and I think that's when I keep referencing the time when I reread this book and you and I were talking, and then, we got married, blah, blah, blah. But you said a lot of good stuff then. So sorry I keep bringing it up. But like, I do think one of the things David, I can see David's funny smile. One of the things you brought up that really helped me as someone who had no familiarity with the Orthodox world then and was rereading this book was that like, we're all laughing about this like coffin flying out, and it is funny. Like I think even in an Orthodox worldview, it's funny, but there's still a way to like Western Americans that if we grew up in any religious tradition, it was mostly Protestant. That's so far-fetched and insane. And Russian piety does believe in miracles in a way that I think we as Americans don't, right? Like that's I'm not trying to undermine the humor here. Like it's a funny scene, and I think it's supposed to be funny. But like one of the things you really helped me understand is when it's talking about realism and miracles. Like there is still to this day like an ongoing belief in supernatural miracle happenings in a way that I think most Americans are really uncomfortable with. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think miracles are fairly commonplace and part of the ordinary life in the Orthodox Church. While that one certainly is not something that's although it does say Alyosha totally believes that one, right? It did mention that. But it is worth knowing that that's the context, is like there is lots of weird stuff happening all the time, in the Orthodox world. It's not seen as unusual. So it's far-fetched, but it's not as far-fetched as it seems to us,
That's all I wanted to say is I think that almost makes it more funny is that like it's this ridiculous miracle, but like just because you're saying it's a theme to watch, there's going to be a lot more discussion of miracles, and some of the things that sound equally insane to us as Americans like actually happen in the life of the Orthodox Church.
I'd like to share one story from an actual contemporary elder that maybe contextualizes this a little bit. Here's an example of a miracle story. One of the biggest saints in recent times is an elder named Porphyrios. He lived on Mount Athos, which is a peninsula of just monks. It's actually referenced in this chapter as a place that had this whole tradition of elders for over 1,000 years. And Porphyrios had the gift of discernment, so people would come to him and he would immediately have the answer to their problem, even though they hadn't told him what it was. This is my absolute favorite Porphyrios story. So there were people that were kind of like his disciples, or just people that he looked after, and they would come to him for advice. And one of them lived in like Australia or something. It was way far away, and he would call on the phone sometimes, you know, when he had a big problem, and the elder would tell him what to do. Well, Porphyrios died. But this guy, being in Australia, way far away, didn't know that Porphyrios died. So it's like a month after, or a couple weeks after his death, this Australian guy calls up Elder Porphyrios, and Porphyrios answers the phone and is like, "My child, you're having a difficult time in life right now. Here's why. You got to stop treating your wife this way. Like, do this instead. And by the way, don't call me at this number anymore because I've died and gone to heaven." So take that for some context. Like,
And that's an accepted thing that people are like, yeah, that happened.
well, there's about 1,000 of these types of stories about Porphyrios. And
Yeah, I don't just take one. I mean, once it becomes voluminous, like it makes you kind of start thinking about it. I mean, we've got thousands of years of this kind of stuff bound up, and some of it's kind of ridiculous. Like have we got to the belovingly yet?
no, that's next.
No, next.
I mean,
Oh, that's like another. It's like straight out of a hagiography almost, but
We'll say that the next time.
well, when you hear one story like that, I go like, yeah, and Joseph Smith had some plates, he said.
Right.
Like that's, you know, you got to give me the whole book.
Yeah.
I need to know the volume.
Yeah. The Porphyrios and these guys are a great example because they're actually within the modern era with witnesses and documents that lived in recent times, and you know, it's not some ancient past. And I actually can share a book with accounts like this. I just want to give that as an example of,
Sure.
here's for context. This is not weird.
yeah, he also like bilocated and did a whole bunch of other stuff. Was he the one that like floated too? I don't know. There's so many other stories that just kind of like mixed in. It's like, well, you know, maybe some of these are crazy and not, but you know, it's like not everyone's insane that's telling these stories, and it's just like once you get so many of them, and then you know, it's like obviously there's a healthy skepticism that's even present within the Orthodox Church too. Not everything that we see is a miracle, and there's often other explanations too.
I think
there's a lot of crazy Orthodox.
May I ask a question about orthodoxy and miracles?
Sure.
So it's my understanding, I mean, I could be wrong, but the people who really believe in the miracles and take that stuff seriously, when they do investigations, they're going to be the most skeptical, right? Because they're the ones who, even though they believe in them, they're also going to think that they're pretty rare. And so aren't they, even though they believe in them and take them completely seriously, aren't they always going to be the most skeptical in terms of trying to figure out the veracity? I mean, it's pretty severe. Like, I mean, like the treatment they give them when they investigate them, I would imagine is about as severe as you can get, right?
Well, I think that's the attitude you're describing is what I would call particularly Catholic.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we're radically different from that, but I do think maybe one difference is when you say they're rare, I don't think we agree with that. In fact, in some places, they're almost commonplace. To the
Okay,
point
when I say rare, I guess what I mean is rare in terms of like versus claims. Like I know that's very difficult. How do you qualify the word rare? You know, I don't know how to qualify.
I guess the point I'm trying to make here is sometimes we don't pay that much attention to them because they're not as big a deal. Like, you know, these things.
What's a commonplace?
It doesn't,
you know, it's
doesn't
like,
matter if a miracle happened. We don't, so you don't care, you know, because It's not like a giant thing that shakes your worldview. And it ultimately, I think, this is a big point Dostoevsky is often railing on. I think is like miracles don't create faith. You can see one happen, and if you don't want to believe it, you're not going to, even if it's right in front of your face. That was in this chapter. So I just don't.
It's in the account of the Gospels. I don't know if everyone's Christian or not, but like it's in the Gospels of Christ. Like the Pharisees watch him like raising people up, like paralytics and stuff, and they're yelling at him for doing it on a Sunday. Like, it's like,
yeah,
it's kind of ridiculous witness, and they're like super skeptical. It's like, well, you're doing it on a Sabbath. It's got to be like diabolical, and like you're crazy, and this was just a sham, and you're just trying to break the system, and look at all these followers you have. You're just trying to create all this uproar and get all this revolution and stuff. So
to Micah's point and question, I think it certainly is not an environment of automatic acceptance, and I think what a priest would tell you is something like, well, don't base your faith on it, but there is certainly an environment where this is more normal.
Yeah, normal and frequent would be like how I would see it.
Can I ask maybe a detailed question of order here? Do miracles differ from like the gifts of the Spirit that like certain types of Protestants believe in, like tongues and discernment and stuff like that? Or are those just one and the same?
Yeah, I think there's a big discrepancy between the Protestant view of miracles, which are like kind of like this faith-based showboating almost, and like Orthodox miracles. I think on the whole, Orthodox miracles are more quiet type miracles, like deeply individual, deeply personal, and very slight and calm. I've seen both sides of it, like whole speaking in tongues, like running around like you're on fire or something like that. That's not Orthodox.
I also just, as someone who was so alien to the Orthodox world and has become part of it, like the things I remember McGee telling me about is like in the Orthodox Church, there still is the belief in like incorrupt bodies, right? Saints who die and their bodies don't rot, icons that weep. So like I know that there's like the smaller miracles that are common, but I also do think there's this level that it's not just about like spiritual miracles. It's really about physical, like, I don't know. I'm not explaining it well. I'm not Orthodox.
I think what you're trying to say is it's what Americans would consider a real miracle.
Right.
Right. Well,
and
I mean,
I feel like some Protestant miracles are kind of like, but whereas this is like, you can't explain this in the physical order of things. And that's a normal part of the world of Orthodoxy. And I think that's really important for this book, because that's a thing that's going to come up in the plot multiple times.
Well, that's why I ask, because I'm familiar with like in Acts and the gifts and that sort of thing. But this is just anything that defies like physical law as we know it. I mean, I'm asking for a
I think you're coming at this from a realist, like the exact same problem that this book is trying to address, like the role of realism versus miraculous, and how like if you see a miracle as a realist, like it's not going to convince you. It's not going to convince you. It's got to be like tied to some sort of answer to something. That's typically what these miracles show up as an answer. Although, of course, like the original Christian miracle is the resurrection of Christ. I mean, like that's a pretty big thing, and it's pretty bodily, and it's kind of insane to think about. But like just like every other miracle that's there. So
I guess I'm looking for more of a definition, and if it's if it's based in like what I'm saying, or what I would look at as miracles, or like that's written in the letters. But is it something? How would it be defined by like a church father or a monk? Or
if I can just ground this a little bit back in the actual book that we're reading, some examples. I'm not going to give you a definition here, but some examples are already cited in the chapter with the elders. Include things like healing from an illness, the ability to read someone else's thoughts, know what their problem is, and give them the comfort or advice they need to get beyond that problem. Those are particularly things that are associated with this elder. There's already the sense of expectation that this guy is going to produce even bigger miracles after he dies and becomes like officially a saint. And at that point, they're expecting things like his relics might be incorrupt, meaning his body doesn't ever rot. Or maybe there are going to be healings of pilgrims who come to visit, his relics or his tomb. Those are typical kinds of Orthodox miracles.
Okay.
It would be things that don't have a natural explanation. Although in this book, I think Dostoevsky is particularly almost goes out of his way to say, well, some of these things we're not sure. With this elder, it's hard to tell. Like there could be a natural explanation for any of this stuff, the way he phrases the discernment thing is like, well, he's seen so many people, he can tell just by the look on their face what's troubling them. Maybe that's natural from experience. Maybe it's natural. Maybe people had a sudden turn for the good in their health for a reason outside of him, but it kind of looks like a miracle. We don't know. This book is not going to answer. It's going to keep you on that fence. Is this a miracle or not? But
I think
within
isn't there like a related topical point with this? Because I know one of the things that Dostoevsky is oftentimes when we talk about free thinkers, we often associate them with rationalists. But to remind that for Dostoevsky, a free thinker is not going to be bound by anything, including rationalism, in the sense that, the idea that for anyone to come in to say miracles are impossible, to Dostoevsky, that person is not a free thinker simply because they're eliminating the possibility of the thing, which he wouldn't want to do. Right? He's not necessarily, the book isn't going to say, yes, absolutely, miracles are real, you need to believe them. But isn't like the very point is he's trying to demarcate the difference between being a free thinker and a dogmatic rationalist.
Right. I think that's and I think that is what the realist and miracle paradox is about here is like, some of us on either side have made up our minds so much that no matter what the evidence is, we're not gonna, it's like, that's not making an impact, But Aaron, I don't think you need a specific definition of the Orthodox idea of a miracle to understand what's going on. I'm not sure that there is a specific definition, but
that's a definition in itself.
But it's when something happens out of the ordinary that catches your attention, like, I don't know how that is possible, would be how I describe it. And we would generally say that came from a divine power rather than some natural explanation. Yes.
It's like a healthy sense of mystery. If I would say it's like there's.
Yeah.
It's the closest you can get to it, I think.
Gotcha.
I don't think you have to have the answer to that to understand the book. I do think it's important to know that it doesn't seem as weird in the Russian context as it does in ours.
Okay.
I saw your bear floating earlier, Aaron. I saw the little bear miracle where he floated across the sky.
He prayed to the queen honeybee and he floated.
Yeah, I was going to ask, does your bear have a name?
Oh, this is Baby Bear.
Okay. I've been wondering. Everybody's been talking about this philosophy, and I'm like, does the bear have a name?
You probably better send a 3-line bio introduction, beginning of CV for the bear, is what we're saying.
Will do. Okay. Just him or all the bears? That's the question.
Oh, God.
Aaron, please bring a different bear every week.
Yes, bring the really big bear. Can you bring the really big bear?
Absolutely.
One time dress up as a bear.
Okay.
Oh, no.
I've been thinking about teaching all this semester in a bear or a Pikachu costume. So,
gentlemen and ladies, I believe this signals the official end of our recording. So I'm going to stop the broadcast at this point. People can stay on to chat and talk more, but we're 2 hours in, and I'm just going to stop the recording.